Surviving winter in the Middle Ages was basically nature's way of saying, good luck, you'll need it. While fairy tales paint images of roaring fires and cozy castle halls, the truth for most peasants was living inside what felt like a giant walk-in freezer. If you've ever rolled out of bed before sunrise in a house colder than your neighbor's smile, you've got an idea of their daily reality. To really understand, compare it to today. We complain when our heating bill spikes, or when the thermostat dips under 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Medieval peasants didn't have that luxury. Records show that winters in Europe during the period could drop to brutal lows, sometimes hitting 0 degrees Fahrenheit in places like England or northern France. That's cold enough to freeze your shoes to the ground, which, believe it or not, sometimes actually happened. The day for a peasant began before the sun did, dragging themselves out of icy beds to check animals or start chores. One chronicler even mentioned that farm workers often woke with frost coating their eyelashes. Now that's a medieval version of an alarm clock. And speaking of beds, you wouldn't call what they slept on beds by modern standards. Forget memory foam. Most peasants made giant piles of straw and hay on the ground, something like a DIY mattress project gone horribly wrong. But surprisingly, these crude sleeping setups actually did the job. Archaeological digs of medieval cottages show that these straw beds could be stacked nearly 2 feet deep, basically a king-sized heap made from whatever was left after the harvest. Families gathered hay during summer and set aside extra bundles, specifically to refresh their bedding during the winter months. The layers were thick enough to lift sleepers off the freezing earth. Considering most houses had dirt floors that turned into solid permafrost in the cold season, that was crucial. Each morning, peasants shook out their bedding, and sometimes they discovered more than they bargained for. Mice often burrowed into the warmth. Insects snuck in for a snack. One tale even mentions a peasant waking to find a chicken had laid an egg under him. That's what you call an authentic version of breakfast in bed. The real advantage of hay was its natural insulation. When tightly packed, it trapped tiny air pockets, acting like medieval bubble wrap to keep heat from escaping. Families layered hay with whatever else they had: rags, old blankets, even dried moss. On especially frigid nights, they swapped in fresh hay, since older straw lost its insulating power once compressed. The downside? Straw beds soaked up dampness like sponges. In a wet medieval climate, that meant musty smells and mold. And if you happened to suffer from hay allergies, tough luck, there were no antihistamines at the village apothecary. One nobleman, after spending a night on a peasant's hay pile, complained for weeks that it made him sneeze so much he thought his nose would fall off. But hey, bedding wasn't just for sleep. During the day, these piles doubled as chairs, so visitors ended up sitting around on straw heaps as if they were rustic beanbags. They didn't look stylish, but one small bonus: bedbugs preferred fabric, so hay was less attractive to them than cloth mattresses. Still, if there was one material that truly defined peasant life in the winter, it was wool. Wool was their equivalent of a superhero costume, except instead of saving lives, it saved people from freezing to death. Families leaned on it so much that historians estimate a household might have owned up to 20 pounds of wool garments. Picture the weight of a small child, except this child made you warm and itchy at the same time. So where did all that wool come from? Each spring, shepherds sheared their sheep, and peasants either bought or bartered for the raw fleece. But wearing it wasn't as simple as throwing it over your shoulders. Processing wool required endless hours of washing, carding, and spinning, and you thought modern laundry day was bad. Here's a fun detail. Medieval wool still carried lanolin, the oily coating from sheep's skin. That made garments water resistant. Sure, they smelled strongly of sheep when wet, but raindrops slid right off. Clever peasants realized that leaving some lanolin in the fibers meant they stayed drier longer, even if they smelled like a barn. And here's why wool clothing almost never got washed. Soaking it in the middle of winter was a death sentence. Wet wool in freezing air froze solid. One story tells of a man who washed his wool coat only to find it stiff enough to stand upright on its own. The neighbors thought it was hilarious and joked about him for weeks. Of course, wool wasn't perfect. It attracted fleas constantly. The common trick was to hang clothes in the smoke of the fire, hoping to drive the pests away. The trade-off? The wearer ended up smelling like a blend of bonfire and barnyard. You could call wool the unofficial perfume of the medieval poor. Its real magic came during the nastiest snowstorms. Modern tests show that even drenched, wool keeps about 80% of its warmth. Peasants didn't need a laboratory to prove that. They were the test subjects. They slogged through icy winds bundled in layer after layer, looking more like hay bales with legs than actual people. But one garment alone wasn't enough when the cold came crashing down. The trick was piling on as many pieces as possible, no matter how ridiculous it looked. Medieval fashion rules, boiled down to a simple idea. If you could still swing your arms, you weren't wearing enough. These folks didn't just bundle up. They perfected the art of becoming human closets. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence showing that during the coldest months, peasants wore anywhere from 4 to 7 layers at once. Imagine someone raiding every clothesline in town and putting it all on at once. That was your average winter wardrobe. It usually started with a long linen undershirt reaching to the knees. Over that came a wool tunic, then another one, because why stop at one? Followed by a jerkin, basically a sleeveless jacket. If fortune smiled, they topped it all off with a fur-lined cloak. A rope belt tied everything together, less for looks and more, so the whole mess didn't fall off mid-shore. Of course, putting on this many layers wasn't quick. One account even describes a man who got so hopelessly tangled that his wife had to roll him around the floor like a barrel until he wriggled free. And you thought modern skinny jeans were difficult. Still, the peasants were onto something. Science today confirms that multiple thin layers are far better at trapping warmth than a single thick one. They figured this out through centuries of trial, error, and likely frostbite. The real headache came when nature called. Stripping off 6 layers in the middle of the night just to visit the outhouse? That was practically a full quest. Some reports even mention people avoiding water in winter, just so they wouldn't have to go through the nightmare of undressing. Children had it even harder. Parents wrapped them in so many clothes that they waddled around like penguins who'd had too much to drink. One medieval writer joked that in winter, you could always recognize kids in the village. They were the round little bundles, rolling down hills because they couldn't bend their legs properly. But all the layering in the world wasn't enough without fire. And the fireplace in a peasant hut was a far cry from cozy. It was little more than a fire pit dug into the floor, with smoke drifting wherever it pleased. Chimneys weren't common yet, which meant the whole house smelled like permanent barbecue. Archaeologists have found that most of these pits were only about 3 feet wide, and that less than 20% of the heat stayed in the room. The rest escaped through gaps in the roof when it wasn't letting snowflakes drop straight onto your dinner. Fuel was another daily battle. Forget stacks of seasoned firewood. That was a luxury. Peasants burned anything that would catch a broken stool, cracked tools, even planks from abandoned barns. One record from England describes villagers tearing down an empty barn beam by beam just to survive one particularly brutal winter. Needless to say, the landlord wasn't thrilled. Keeping the flame alive was its own science. Families banked coals and ash overnight, hoping they'd stay alive until morning. Lose them, and you were trekking to borrow fire from a neighbor. One tale tells of a man carrying a glowing coal home inside a hollowed-out turnip, sprinting so fast to keep it lit that people thought he was fleeing demons. As miserable as the smoke was, it stung eyes and wrecked lungs. It did offer a few unexpected perks. It drove off insects and even preserved wooden beams. Tests on medieval houses show that layers of soot actually protected the wood from rotting. Not exactly a trick you'll find in home magazines today. Families had different rituals for tending their hearth. Some took turns staying awake to feed the flames. Others developed clever ways of covering embers to keep them glowing till dawn. A few even whispered to the fire when stoking it, convinced it would burn brighter if treated kindly. More likely, that was just the smoke playing tricks on their heads. After long days of freezing outdoors and choking indoors, peasants still needed something to warm them from within their food. Winter meals were less about variety and more about survival. Most families had a handful of ingredients they recycled all season long, usually tough root vegetables that looked more like something out of a nightmare garden than a cookbook. Turnips, parsnips, and neeps, a medieval turnip cousin with an unfortunate name, dominated the menu. The recipe never changed. Dump everything in a pot, add water, and hope the result didn't taste like boiled dirt. It wasn't gourmet, but it kept them alive, which in medieval winter was an achievement all on its own. That pot wasn't just for dinner. It hung above the fire all day, waiting for whatever scraps the family could toss in. Records from the time show some truly bizarre ingredients making their way into these stews. Bark for roughage, tiny stones for supposed minerals, and yes, even scraps of leather for protein. One chronicle even describes a desperate family boiling their own wooden spoon and insisting it gave the broth extra flavor. But peasants weren't clueless. They had clever ways to stretch their food through the bitter season. Summer and fall were all about preserving whatever they could. Root vegetables were packed carefully in sand or tucked away in cool storage pits. Meat, if it was ever available, was heavily salted or hung in the smoke to last months. Some families got so good at it that their neighbors would bargain with them for tips. 3 turnips for your meat smoking secret was a perfectly reasonable exchange. Even more impressive was their knowledge of wild plants. These villagers knew their countryside like the backs of their dirt-caked hands. They could identify which herbs perked up a bland stew and which ones disguised the taste of meat that had seen better days. A favorite was poor man's pepper, a common weed that added enough bite to make almost anything edible. But the real prize was the stash of dried herbs saved from summer. Bundles dangled from ceiling beams, making homes look like rustic apothecaries. Flavor wasn't the only purpose. Many herbs doubled as crude medicine, helping peasants fend off coughs and fevers that came with cold weather. And they needed all the help they could get, especially with lungs already blackened from smoke-filled rooms. At the end of the day, everyone gathered around the ever-simmering pot, swapping gossip while trying not to think too hard about what, exactly, floated in their bowl. But food wasn't their only company. Archaeological studies reveal that as much as 30% of the floor space in winter huts was shared with livestock. Chickens, sheep, pigs, and sometimes even cows were moved indoors when the cold set in. It wasn't random. Each animal brought its own unique heating system. A single cow could pump out as much warmth as a small fire, around 5,000 BTUs per hour. Villagers didn't understand the math, but they certainly understood the comfort of sleeping next to a warm cow. Pigs worked like snoring space heaters. Chickens were perfect for warming feet, and sheep doubled as living wool blankets. Of course, sharing space came with plenty of chaos. Imagine trying to eat dinner while a curious pig shoved its snout into your stew. Archaeologists have found traces of makeshift barriers built to pen animals in certain corners, though by all accounts, the animals treated them more as light suggestions than real boundaries. Nighttime must have been unforgettable. Between lowing cattle, grunting pigs, and roosters deciding it was morning whenever they pleased, sleep was a skill you simply had to master. One traveling merchant wrote that he was convinced a particular rooster hated him personally. It crowed in his face every time he drifted off. Still, there were benefits. Animals doubled as security alarms, with honking geese acting as feathered watchdogs, and their warm breath added humidity to the room. Scientists now know humidity makes a room feel several degrees warmer, though medieval families only knew it worked. Some households even had a system for arranging their barnyard roommates. Chickens usually got the window ledge so they could greet the sunrise, while bigger animals like cows were pushed against the stone walls to maximize reflected heat. It was, in its own way, a medieval version of a housing policy, just with a lot more manure. Still, keeping warm inside was only half the battle. They also had to design their homes to fight back against the freezing outdoors. Their trick? Many houses were partially underground. Archaeological digs show that nearly 40% of northern European peasant homes were sunken by several feet. This wasn't luxury living, but it was brilliant. Soil holds a steady temperature of about 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit once you dig down a bit. Modern scientists call this geothermal insulation. Medieval families just knew digging deeper meant shivering less. Typically, they excavated 3 or 4 feet, built walls up from there, and wound up with a house that stayed warmer in the winter and pleasantly cooler in summer. As for construction, they used whatever they could scavenge: mud, straw, stones, wood. If it could be jammed into a wall, it worked. Resourceful villagers sometimes stole cut stones from old Roman ruins, leaving behind houses that were part medieval hut, part ancient empire. Lords didn't exactly love this recycling habit, but when survival was on the line, a stone was a stone. A finishing touch was draft control. Every hole, crack, and gap was stuffed with a mix of mud, straw, and manure. Not glamorous, but in the dead of winter, it meant the difference between a cold night and a survivable one. This medieval version of caulking actually did the job. Experiments with reconstructed huts show it cut heat loss by nearly 60%. Not bad for mud and dung, though it certainly made "this place is a dump" a little too literal. Doors were another clever detail. Most cottages had just a single entryway, carefully positioned away from the worst winds. That wasn't luck. It was deliberate design. In some homes, the doorway extended into a little covered passage, like a crude tunnel. One medieval writer said it felt like crawling down a dragon's gullet, and with all the barnyard stench inside, he probably wasn't wrong. As for roofs, they weren't simple thatch jobs. They were built layer upon layer: sticks, straw, then more sticks and more straw, sometimes capped with turf. In many villages, people actually let grass sprout on the rooftops, not because they were eco-friendly visionaries, but because the roots acted like natural glue. Plus, if the family goat decided to climb up for a snack, no one complained. Still, a snug home only solved part of the problem. To face the blizzards outside, peasants needed an arsenal of winter gear, and they had one. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence that the typical villager owned half a dozen to 8 key tools, passed carefully from one generation to the next. These weren't luxuries. They were survival. Top of the list was the snow shovel, though it didn't look like anything at your local hardware store. Carved from solid hardwood, with a broad, flat blade, it was actually more effective at moving heavy drifts than most modern plastic versions. Trials with replicas show they could haul about 30% more per scoop. The catch? Each one weighed about as much as a toddler. Clearing snow was basically medieval weight training. Then there were socks, and they were worth their weight in poultry. A record from one town notes that a good pair could cost the same as a chicken. But these weren't plain wool. Craftsmen stitched rabbit fur between layers of wool to make feet warm enough to roast. One chronicler even complained that his socks were so cozy, he feared his toes would overcook. The strangest gadget was the snow scorer, a long pole used to mark safe routes when snow buried the landscape. Villagers planted them along paths before storms, turning the white wilderness into something navigable. One settlement even dyed theirs with berry juice, creating a kind of medieval GPS in bright reds and purples. But the true champion of cold weather gear? The mitten. Not gloves, mittens. Centuries before science confirmed it, peasants knew that keeping fingers huddled together held in more heat. These mittens weren't store-bought either. People stuffed them with whatever insulation they could scrounge. Moss, chicken feathers, even cat hair. Recycling at its warmest. And since weather forecasts were little more than staring at the horizon, tools had to be ready at all times. Still, peasants did have their own folk predictions. If the cows inside the house started pressing closer, that meant a storm was brewing. If pigs dragged in extra straw, bitter cold was on the way. Primitive? Maybe, but surprisingly reliable. All these adaptations reveal just how inventive ordinary people became when survival demanded it. From half-buried homes to shared space with cows, from endless stew pots to fur-padded socks, medieval peasants built their own handbook for enduring winter, one frost-bitten season at a time.